as I said before, one of the things that my commentary is really driven by is the fact that, first of all, I just found out that I'm Jewish in 2008, and of course I kind of maybe suspected that we were when I heard my dad pronounce our name Charnetsky. I mean, and especially because the stereotype is that ski and ski names, S-K-I and S-K-Y, do tend to be Jewish names. And if you really wanted to hide that you were Jewish, you really wouldn't make an effort to pronounce your name like that. And also with the way that they did hide that we were Jewish, and of course they dropped hints, but hints that kind of, for whatever reason, flew over my head, and they shouldn't have flown over my head. And also given the fact that I was raised in a church where every darn time they read scripture, you could tell they didn't like the Jews. There was just something in their tone and the way they said certain things that they just did not like Jews. And I could even, maybe I'm being too much doubting myself, or maybe I remembered wrongly, but for some reason I remember that whenever they read scripture, they would read it like, now when the Jews, da-da-da-da-da, and for whatever reason, they did not like the Jews. So of course, unfortunately, not knowing that I'm Jewish and hearing the way that they would talk about Jews, I kind of got the anti-Semitic / self-hating stuff ingrained into my head a little bit, even at a subconscious level, and I suspected we were Jewish, and suddenly it became evident that clearly I had no choice but to, first of all, embrace my Jewish heritage, because I've been given something that, well, there's complicated ways to say what I gotta say, but first of all, I guess 3 major points. First of all, I'm Jewish. Why deny it? Why pretend or do what the family is doing? Why just say, oh, it happened a long time ago, I don't care, I don't give a crap, whatever. Or again, why deny it? Why say, oh, well, we're a bunch of Polish, Lithuanians, and Slovaks, and I mean, if we really were, fine, but the evidence shows quite otherwise, that we were Ashkenazi Anusim, and some of us probably were before surnames were taken, or we even took surnames that would kind of hide that fact. And also, when Scripture talks about the Jews, Scripture does not let me put it this way. Scripture does not talk about Jews in a nasty way and in the anti-Semitic way that so many so-called Christians, and even many Christians who are just not really thinking about what they're doing and saying, and really thinking about what they've absorbed in their head, Scripture does not talk about Jews it might certainly say things like sometimes the Jews can be stiff-necked people and all that, but that's saying too that's a long discussion, but Jews are no better than Gentiles, and Gentiles are no better than Jews, and again, that's a long discussion, but it certainly isn't nasty like saying that, I can't believe, God forbid, I'm repeating this, but it came up recently, and unfortunately I was even reading a case where, a summary of a case where a lawyer actually wants to go to The Hague and sue Jews for being, actually I could pull up that email if I wanted to, but is it really worth giving that guy attention? But then you have to confront the evil too, and besides, I wasn't exactly prepared to pull up the email when I was going into this, and I wasn't really thinking about that lawyer, but now that the examples come up, and obviously sometimes you think about things when you're talking, but anyway, the lawyer wants to go sue Jews in court for killing Jesus, and of course Jews were, just so many, even if you Google, you see anti-Semitic stuff and stereotypes and just all these things, and even someone made a really nasty anti-Semitic comment to me on my Facebook page recently. He thought that I was referring to my own granddad when I was quoting someone, and he, believe it or not, said that he said that, and the person I quoted was Chelsea Handler, because I wanted to make the point that she had said that her granddad had served in the German army, and whether or not he agreed with Hitler, he still served in the German army. And I said, thank you, Chelsea Handler. You basically, you're making my point that, and there were many Germans who, or maybe not many, but at least quite a few, who defied conscription and who saved Jews and who said, if I have to go to the concentration camps, so be it. I'm going to save these Jews. And even I keep seeing on Facebook this one picture where this guy who is married to a Jewish woman refused to give the Nazi salute during a rally. And when people say, well, some Germans were forced and whatever, I just don't buy that excuse, because again, many Germans said, I'm not going to put Jews in the concentration camps. I'm not going to go along with someone who says all the horrible things that the Nazis were saying. And when you are Jewish like me, and when you find that out, it's not, you can just say, oh, I don't give a crap about what happened thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago. Like, I don't really care that we're Jewish and that we're, part of the people that went through the Inquisition and pogroms and what happened a long time ago. Again, you just don't, when you find out that you're Jewish, or when you know that you're Jewish, even if you want to think differently, you just don't have that luxury, or so-called luxury, of denying that you're a Jew, and you don't have that luxury, or again, so-called luxury of really assimilating and saying whatever, because in the end, you're going to get judged for it. And even if you didn't know all your life that you're Jewish, and you find out on Judgment Day, God's going to say to you, well, for what you did know, even if you didn't know that you're actually Jewish, did you still help the Jewish people, and did you still do what you needed to do? And Scripture, first, Scripture gives warnings about what happens if you don't, for lack of a better term, if you don't give a crap about the Jewish people. And I even have a cousin I continue to argue with. He continues to try to deny that we're Jewish, and he makes awful statements like this. I'm trying to see where the statement is. Oh, here's his statements. What is it that you want? Just because someone was Jewish in the past doesn't mean they have to make Aliyah or be involved in Jewish causes. I really don't get your warnings and heeding them. Well, first of all, it's, as I told him, it's not even my warnings. It's Scripture's warnings. And I can read you some of those warnings, and I'll quote them right here and right now. And I don't know if he's done his homework. I would wish he would go read the stuff for himself and do the darn work, and especially since he, was going to be pretty high up in the Roman Vaticanist Church once. He definitely could have had access to Scripture, and if I have to read the, Vaticanist translations, I'll go ahead and do that. There's plenty of them out there, the New Revised Standard Version. If someone needs a quote from that, for example, I could do it, or the Dude Rhymes translation. I could do whatever, but I, for my own reasons, tend to use the New King James Version, and I don't know how much clearer Scripture has to get. And it says right here, this is from in this case I'm using the Mekon Mamre translation, because I do want to reach out to those who are not believers and who are reading my blog. And very clearly, and I like I said, I can't just make up random warnings. These are in Scripture. What happens to Jews who don't make Aliyah, for example? At the time, saith the Lord, they shall bring out the bones of the kings of Judah, and the bones of his princes, and the bones of the priests, and the bones of the prophets, and the bones of the inhabitants of Jerusalem out of their graves. And they shall spread them before the sun and the moon, and all the hosts of heaven, whom they have loved, and whom they have served, and after whom they have walked, and whom they have sought, and whom they have worshipped. They shall not be gathered nor buried, they shall be for dung upon the face of the earth. And death shall be chosen rather than life by all the residue that remain of this evil family, that remain in all the places whither I have driven them, saith the Lord of hosts. Moreover, thou shalt say unto them, Thus saith the Lord, Do men fall and not rise up again? Doth one turn away and not return? Why then is this people of Jerusalem slidden back by perpetual backsliding? They hold fast to deceit, they refuse to return. I attended and listened, but they spoke not aright. No man repenteth him of his wickedness, saying, What have I done? Every one turneth away in his course, as a horse that rusheth headlong in the battle. And I don't know how much more clearer I have to get. And forgive my grammar, that was really bad grammar. It should have been much more clear. But anyway, I could go on, but it says, in terms of, again, I talked about the Jewish people and what Scripture says, and not only does Scripture say that, hey, if a Jew doesn't make Aliyah, he's in trouble, it also says this, Then the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Thus saith the Lord, After this manner I will mar the pride of Judah and the great pride of Jerusalem, even this evil people that refuse to hear my words, that walk in the stubbornness of their heart, and are gone after other gods to serve them, and to worship them, that it be as this girdle, which is profitable for nothing. For as the girdle cleaveth to the loins of man, so I have caused to cleave unto me the whole house of Israel, and the whole house of Judah, saith the Lord, that they might be unto me for a people, and for a name, and for a praise, and for a glory. But they would not hearken. Or hearken, however you pronounce it. But my point is this. So when Scripture says right in front of your face that if you're a Jew, or that if you find out you're a Jew, or you even suspect that you might be Jewish, if you do know that you're Jewish, or if you do know that you came from a crypto-Jewish family, or what, you don't have the so-called luxury of just sitting there and saying, oh yeah, I'm not going to get involved with Jewish causes, and I'm not going to make Aliyah, and I'm not going to do this and do that. And I mean, if there's a reason that you're called not to make Aliyah, which would be very, very hard to believe, maybe there's one or two or however many exceptions that can make Aliyah, but even in terms of not the first exile, the second exile, the one that we all know as the Babylonian exile, because there was the Assyrian exile, and what else can you do? Do you sit there and just go, I mean, forgive my language, but if you don't make Aliyah, and if you don't get involved with your Jewish heritage, again, forgive my language, but you're basically saying, fuck you, God, I don't need to trust you. And God's going to say, fine, then you're going to die, your bones are probably going to be scattered all over the place. And it even says, they shall bring out the bones of the kings of Judah, and the bones of his princes, and the bones of his priests. And hey, if you wanna die in the diaspora and have your bones brought back to Jerusalem. Oh, another thing too, by the way, now that I think about it, so yeah, the final judgment's gonna come after the 1,000 years, and if you aren't raptured or saved during the tribulation, actually, the thing is when you are saved during the tribulation, okay, so if you're not raptured and you're already dead, oh, it's pretty clear, unfortunately, where you're going if you're not raptured and you're already dead. But if you are left behind and you survive the tribulation, you've made it to the millennial kingdom, and you're going to get saved. At least if you're Jewish, because it does talk about how some families are going to be stubborn and not want to go up and celebrate Sukkot, and then they're going to get no rain. And that indicates either that, in that case, Gentiles may not necessarily be saved, or if they are saved, they're going to be stubborn and say, well, we're saved now, we can be under grace. And grace happened before the rapture, before the millennial kingdom. If you didn't accept grace before the rapture, you're in trouble. You don't have grace now. You're back under you're both under the new covenant and the old covenant at the same time. And by the way, a lot of so-called Hebrew roots folks are confused about that because they think they're both under the new covenant and the old covenant now. And that's a whole nother discussion. But anyway, the point is that you can't, because again, with the going back to the rapture and the tribulation. So if you don't get raptured and you're already dead, or if you do not get saved during the tribulation or the millennial kingdom or what have you, and you die, you're pretty much in trouble. And I'm thinking that based on that, because it does talk about, I could go on and on and on, but it does talk about the corpses and how they're going to have to dig for, they're going to have to dig for years. Well, maybe those of us who are saved, who are saved will probably not have to dig. And I shouldn't say there, I should say we, because I am Jewish and whatever. And a lot of my OCD plays in that too, because, they really ingrained into my head for years that I was someone different than I... Anyway, you get the point though. And all I'm saying is that when you find out that you're Jewish, or when you know that you're Jewish, you don't have the so-called luxury not to care, because if you don't care about your Jewishness, you're going to die. And obviously dying is going to backfire on you. And especially when you're saved, when you claim to be a Christian, when you say, oh yes, I'm a Christian, and you're Jewish, then you're really in trouble, because what does Jesus say? And he says this through Paul very clearly. Nothing more needs to be said. Now, of course, Paul is writing to the Gentiles here, and I'm trying to find a verse, because, here we go. I did quote this verse. He's talking to the Gentiles here. Besides, and I said this, besides, what did Yeshua say to the Gentiles through Paul? You will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of unbelief, they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. Really, you could, I guess you could translate that fear, but I guess you could also translate that dread, because in English we sometimes tend to confuse fear and dread. Because fear is supposed to be, you're in awe, but I guess in that case you really could be in awe. You really could be thankful that God saved you. You could, whatever. But it says, do not be haughty, but fear, or do not be haughty, but dread. I'd have to check the concordance, because I'm not real versed in Greek and whatever, but for if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fell, severity but toward you goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise you will also be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? So if you're a cultivated branch, you don't have the luxury to say, oh well, I'm just going to be a wild branch. And if you're Jewish and you find out you're Jewish, you don't have the luxury to say, oh, I'm not, for lack of a better term, I'm not going to give a shit. Because again, shame on you if you say that, and it is ultimately going to backfire on you. And I don't know how much clearer that I have to be, that if nothing else, these warnings about, you're going to be in trouble if you don't take your Jewishness seriously, because God made you for his purposes, I don't know how much clearer I have to get. Besides, like I said, would you not care if you're part of a people that has gone through the Inquisitions and the pogroms, and especially if you do want to bring the gospel to Jewish people? It's one thing to have a Gentile bring the gospel to a Jew, fine, but another Jew bringing gospel to the Jews and saying, hey, I can relate to what you've gone through, and I went through the kind of stuff too, the awful stuff that people did in Jesus' name, Yeshua's name. But I can assure you that Yeshua is not this anti-Semite who says, now when the Jews, da 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 da, like, as if the, Jews were really evil or something. And I can assure you that Yeshua does not have the kind of hate for the Jews that many so-called Christians have. And so you're basically saying that if you don't care about your Jewishness, you're basically saying, I don't care about preaching gospel to Jewish people who need it, even though I'm a Jew myself, and I needed the gospel. So, again, just the 3 points that I wanted to sum up. One, when you're a Jew, even if you don't know it, what you do know automatically invalidates you from having the so-called luxury of living as if you're not Jewish. Secondly, Scripture gives stern warnings about what happens if you don't care about your Jewishness, and those warnings can even lead to death if you don't heed those warnings. So my cousin says, I really don't get your warnings and heeding them. Well, I hope he gets them now, because I don't want him to die. I don't want, even too, I've said this, I don't want the rest of my family to die and, be at the final judgment, and they've already had their bones scattered all over the place and brought back to Jerusalem, and then they're going to become these bodies and souls again who are going to end up in the lake of fire. Like I said, I really don't want that for my family. I want them to be saved. I want them to preach the gospel to other Jewish people. And what else can I say? And then the third point again, are you going to give up your opportunity to preach the gospel to the Jewish people and do what Scripture says?